introduction to Spring Boot, introduction to Spring Boot. So before getting into the concept, okay, let me tell you, before getting into the concepts or before Spring Boot, before Spring Boot, why do we need this? So everyone or any user or any people or any student, please make sure that one thing, why do we need it? So think about these things. Why do we need it? Before Spring Boot, why do we need it? So what is Spring Boot and why we need to understand about Spring Boot and everything we need to know, okay? But before Spring Boot, what we have and why Spring Boot got introduced. Okay, fine. So let me get into the concept. So so before understanding, before understanding about Spring Boot, let me tell you, student table or students or any working professionals or anyone need to understand. Student must know the problems of. Students must know the problems of. Students must know the problems of Spring Framework. Student must know the problems of Spring Framework and only what are the problems and only then learning Spring Boot will make a sense. So before learning the Spring Boot directly, so first know the problems of Spring Framework and then know about the Spring Boot. So whenever you know about the problem, then only you will know the solution for it. Without getting understanding about the problem, without that idea, and we can't even able to get the solution for a problem. So we need to know the problem statement first, and then we need to get a solution for it. So in my case, I'm telling you, before understanding Spring Boot, student must know the problems of Spring Boot, Spring Framework, then know about Spring Boot. Okay, in words, I can tell you only then Spring Boot will make a sense. Will make sense or fine. Before understanding Spring Boot, students must know the problems of Spring Framework. Only then know about Spring Boot. If knowing like in this way, this will make sense. Okay. So next, so let me discuss about first what are the disadvantages of Spring Framework we have, and then we'll move into the introduction to Spring Boot and what is Spring Boot, everything and all. So let me tell you disadvantages of Spring Framework. Disadvantages of Spring Framework. So Spring Framework is also powerful and very much very useful, but it is having some disadvantages. And what are the disadvantages we have? We'll get into this. We'll know in this session. Okay. So Spring Framework, I can tell you directly. Spring Framework is a Spring Framework is a powerful and but it has several disadvantages or well several difficulties. I can tell you several difficulties or several disadvantages, especially for beginners. Okay, especially for beginners who are going to learn Spring and who are going to learn Spring Boot. They have to know about Spring Framework, and they need to know what are the disadvantages or the difficulties we are facing in Spring Framework, how those disadvantages has been covered in Spring Boot. Okay, so especially for the beginners. So fine, beginners. So what are the disadvantages we have? I can tell you the first disadvantage is too much of configuration. I can say too much configuration directly. Too much configuration. So what is configuration? I can tell you in Spring Framework, we need web.xml or we need some files to do. I can tell you we have done several projects on Spring Framework. The projects we discussed is Spring Core module and Spring Core and Spring event. Like we discussed about how to create an APIs, how to everything, performing collaborations using Spring Framework and using Tomcat server and everything. So everything was done very clearly. So but let me discuss in Spring Framework. In Spring Framework, we need web.xml, we need web.xml, and we need application context.xml, application context.xml, and we need dispatcher servlet configuration, dispatcher servlet configuration. I'm writing config, so okay, let me write full form. dispatches let configuration, everything fine. And we need to define the beans manually, either using XML or annotations or else bean definitions. Let me write bean definitions. Either the bean is going to be created by the XML or annotations, anything XML or annotations, or plus we can use configuration classes. This was configuration classes. Fine. What are the configuration class we need to do? Let me explain you. Don't get panic. We haven't discussed about these things in Spring. These are already discussed. You can also previous videos which are shared in the YouTube channel. And see, we'll get to the concept right away. So in Spring, we need web.xml, application.context XML, dispatcher servlet configuration, bean definition. Bean definitions are nothing but we are going to create a beans. We are going to create the beans in XML or using annotations by using config classes. So even for a okay, let me write an next point. Even for small applications, even for small applications, the configuration setup becomes very lengthy. Configuration becomes lengthy and confused. I can say confused because if you are a beginner, if you are learning Spring Framework, you need to set up this configuration every time you create any new application. Every time you need to set up a configuration, and these configuration setup is becoming lengthy and confusing. So okay, so to avoid those things, beginners may get confused like why we need to configure like this, why we are why where we need to configure, and why we are configuring this much of code, why we are writing this much of code like this. So which file controls what, this much of confusion may occur for the beginners. So I don't want you to uh, confuse like that. Let me write what are the confusions may occur, what are the confusions may occur, like beginners may confuse, may like get confused in some question, in some points, like the first point they will get confused like where we need to configure, or else where to configure, and which file controls what, like which file controls what. So these everything questions are going to be arising in a beginner's mind. So all to cover all those things, we are having Spring Boot as well to cover all these things. So this is the first disadvantage we have in Spring Framework. This is the first config disadvantage. What is the disadvantage? Too much of configuration. Okay, we need to create all these type of files and we need to do all these things manually in order to run our application. Okay. Second, let me discuss a second disadvantage. So the second disadvantage we have in Spring Framework is external server dependency. So what is external server dependency in the sense, in traditional Spring applications, or can I tell you, whenever we are working on Spring Core module, in Spring Core module, we don't need any server manually because it is a console application. So, but coming back, if you are working on REST APIs and if you are working on collaborations in Spring Framework, in order to run our application on our web browser, we need to create JSP files as a front end part, everything. So to run this, we need a server. Okay, we need a server. So the server is manually added. We should add the server manually. So the point. Let me write the point. Traditional Spring frameworks or Spring applications require an external server. Requires an external server. So, so what are the external servers we have? We have external servers in the sense the external server I can tell you we use Tomcat server. Okay, Tomcat server and some other external servers also there, but we haven't used it in this Spring framework. We have JBoss server, or else we have some WebLogic server. Okay, these we are some many types in external servers, but we are not going to use all those things. We have used Tomcat server only directly. So why do we need to set up all these things? To set up this server, we must install the server. We must install the server. We must install the server, and we need to configure it. and we need to deploy the war files. Everything should be done manually. Deploying the deploying the war files. Everything is going to be done manually. So in order to avoid all these things, we introduced the concept. We have a concept of Spring Boot in the upcoming session. We are going to discuss about Spring Boot also. So I can tell you if you are doing more setup, I can directly tell you if you are doing more setup for your project, you may get miss one any step. If you may get miss any step, I can tell you miss more setup equal to more errors. It may leads to more errors. What why we are going to lead in more errors in the sense? Let me tell you a simple point. See, for example, you are having 10 steps to be created to be done after creation of your project in order to run your application. Think as a developer, okay? See, you created a Spring Boot application or a Spring application, any application you have created. So after creating that application, in order to run the applications, you must able to do 10 steps. If you forget any step, you are not going to get your output. You are going to get error. So if you think, wait, which step haven't forgotten and which step I forgot to do, if you forget that point or if you forget that step, you are not able to run your application. So more setup is equal to more errors. If you forget any step, you are not going to get the desired output you want. So I can tell you this is the second disadvantage we have. This is the second disadvantages we have in Spring. So what is the third one means disadvantages means dependency management. Dependency management. So what is dependency management? So dependency management is nothing but developers must manually find correct versions. Like when I can tell you, developers must manually find the manually find correct versions. I can tell you what is meant by correct versions and resolve everything. So if you don't want of selecting the wrong versions and everything, we need to select the correct version manually. So in order to see, if you want to, I can tell you, if you want to let me tell you example directly. Let me tell you, whenever you create any Spring application, and whenever you create any Spring application, in order to add any dependency, we need to choose maven repository. We need to go to maven repository, and after going to the maven repository, we are going to search for any required client. I can tell you, let me tell you, Apache or Tomcat. Okay, let me tell you about Tomcat. So if you want Tomcat version, Tomcat dependency to be added in your project manually, because in Spring we need to add our dependencies manually. We can't add them automatically. Okay, so in while adding the dependencies manually, going to Maven repository and coming to the Tomcat and opening the first link, and here we need to search which is the correct version. So we should not select the wrong version. Okay. Here we need to decide and we need to select the correct version. So correct version should be selected by the developers manually in Spring Framework. Okay. Let me tell you clearly. Developers have to need to visit this Maven repository. After visiting this Maven repository, they need to search for the dependency they want. After selecting the dependency, they need to select the correct version. If they select this wrong version, they are going to get errors. So this is going to lead you getting some errors and all. So selecting the right version is very important in using the dependent while adding the dependencies to project. So let me tell you. So developers must manually find the correct versions of. I can tell you, manually find the correct versions. So next, manually find the correct versions, or else we need to resolve the if we select any wrong version. If we select any wrong version, we need to select the dependency conflicts also. Dependency conflicts in the sense we are going to get some errors and all, any warnings and all. So dependency conflicts. So fine, if you select any wrong version, simply I can tell you, if you select, or if any developer or any person selecting the wrong version, what it is going to lead. If you select any wrong version, simply it is going to lead you class not found exceptions, or else any project not found exceptions, any so fine. So if this one wrong version is getting out, if you select any wrong version, what it is going to lead, it is going to you, if it is going to lead you some errors like class not found exception, or else the version conflict, everything is going to happen. Version conflict. So if you select wrong dependency, you are not going to get the desired output. You are going to get errors at your compile time or runtime. Dependency management we successfully completed, and the next disadvantage we have in Spring Boot is slow project setup. Slow project setup. Okay. Next, what is meant by a slow project setup? We are going to discuss very slowly. So, if you are creating a Spring project, I can tell you, creating, if you are creating Spring project from scratch, if you are creating Spring project from scratch, if you are creating Spring projects from scratch, it may take some time. I can tell you, it takes some time, takes time, and it is going to have some needs experience. Whenever we create any Spring applications, it may take some time. I should know why I'm able to know about those things. Means if I created and if I work on Spring framework on Spring applications, I know how it is going to create, how much time it is going to take, everything. It's some experience to use. So I can tell you, it have some experience, needs some experience and all. And I can tell you, it is not a beginner friendly also. Okay, I can tell you, it is not a beginner friendly application. I can tell you, like, not beginner friendly. Simple. So this is a last fourth disadvantage we have, and it is not ideal for. Let me tell you, and it is not ideal for the microservices project. Microservices. What is meant by microservices and all? We are going to discuss in at the time of discussion when we get this concept in Spring Boot. Okay. So no need to discuss everything at the initial time. We are going to discuss about everything. What is microservices and why, what is meant by microservice? How we are going to discuss, how we are going to do in Spring Boot. Everything is going to clear. It is going to understand to you in a clear way, both in theoretical and technical way. Okay. So not ideal for the microservices in the sense. Let me give you the points directly. Spring framework was originally designed for was originally sorry, what is spelling and mistake? Sorry. Originally designed for monolithic applications. I can tell you, monolithic applications. So I can tell you, so microservices need some lightweight and easier setup and easy deployment. Uh, Spring applications are not easy deployment and faster setup and lightweight. So we are not going to discuss this thing in microservices. What is the monolithic architecture and everything? We are going to discuss at the time of microservices. Okay, so let me discuss next disadvantage is like production. Whenever we are going to deploy our application, we need to check our application manually. I can tell you, production. I can tell you, production readiness needs extra effort. Production readiness need extra effort. What is neediness and extra effort in the sense? We need to monitor our application. We need to monitoring or else monitoring. We need to monitor our application, and we need to check is our application is working fine. We need to check our health checks for the application. Is our application is working fine without any errors, or we need to check manually? Why we need to check manually everything? If we done everything automatically, why we need to check is application is running, and if the application is running good without any errors, is every operation is working fine, everything logging everything. So we need to do all these things in manually. I can tell you as metrics, some metrics we have. So what is the metrics? We are going to discuss this in upcoming classes. So So everything I have discussed, everything of all these 6 points what I have mentioned above, everything need to be done manually. So all manual sorry, all need manual configurations. All need manual configurations. So whatever I have mentioned in above, the total 6 points, we need to do everything in order to satisfy all these things. In order to avoid all the errors, we need to satisfy. We need to arrange them manually. We need to create everything. We need to add everything. We need to write everything from scratch. All these things need to be done manually. So these are the problems we have. So what is the summary of the problems I have given you? Simply, just simple. What I can tell you, what is summary I can tell, a summary or conclusion, just in one point I can give you to let you understand people just have clearly elaborated each and every disadvantage. I can directly write each and every point in just step by step. Like I can write directly like this. I can write like this two configuration, and I can write as external server dependency. I can write like this, and I can go to Spring Boot directly. But in my point of view is like writing points is not the matter. Too much of configuration. What is meant by too much of configuration? You must able to know. And external server dependency. What is external server dependency? And we need to do everything manually. So after knowing them clearly, only we can get into the concept. Okay. So I have explained each and every disadvantage and elaborated in a friendly manner. So this will make sure understand what is meant by too much configuration and what is meant by external server dependency. So these are all need to be added automatic manually. Okay, these everything need to be done manually. I can give you in simple points. I can give you in simple points what are the disadvantages of Spring Framework. So I can tell you we are going to get too much configuration. Too much of configuration leads to too much of configuration leads to on what is the impact it is going to create. It is going to confuse the students. Anyone confusing state, like confusing state. And next, what is the disadvantage? External server required. External server required. And what is the impact of this external server required? It is going to take you to set up auto manually. So setup performing the setup manually may take you some extra effort, and it may take your time. It may take your time. So time saving is must understood, guys. So next, dependency management. If you add any wrong dependency, it is going. What is the impact it is going to create? It is going to create some errors. Fine. So next step, what we are going to have slow setup. If it is not set up, it is not even able to set up the application faster. It is going to consume your time. Slow setup or else slow setup. What is the impact of slow setup? It is going to consume your time. I can rightly write as time consuming. In like I'm writing in just single to avoid confusion. Okay. So less microservice point. I can write like these points also less microservice less microservice friendly. So what it is going to do, it is not, I can tell you, it is not going to work as a modern applications. I can tell you it's a not modern applications. No built-in monitoring, no built-in monitoring. So fine, no built-in monitoring in the sense we are the application itself, it is not able to uh, check the application is working fine. His application is working fine without any errors. Did we have any errors in any file? It is going to check manually. If you are going to check this manually, it is why we need to check manually everything. So in Spring Boot, we are going to do everything automatic. I will explain you each and everything. Don't worry. So monitoring, I can tell you like monitoring, no built-in monitoring. If you don't have any built-in monitoring in the system, we need to do some extra work to complete this monitoring setup also. So this is the overall summary. The 6 points I have written on the above in an elaborated way. So just these 6 points will understand you what are the disadvantages in Spring framework we have. Okay. Clearly discussed about what are the disadvantages in Spring framework and all. So let me get into the concept now. Let me get into the concept. Original concept is introduction to Spring Boot. So let me get into the concept of introduction to Spring Boot. So what is Spring Boot then first? What is Spring Boot? If you ask me this question, what is Spring Boot? So let me tell you. what is Spring Boot? So let me tell you directly. So what is Spring Boot? Spring Boot is an extension of Spring Framework. Spring Boot is an extension of Spring Framework. Spring Boot is an extension of Spring Framework that simplifies the development of the Spring applications. Simplify the development of Spring applications. Development of Spring applications, or else Spring. I can tell you not directly Spring. I can tell you Spring based applications. Okay, Spring based applications by reducing the configuration. By reducing the configuration, providing some embedded servers, comma, providing the embedded servers and enabling the faster development and enabling the faster deployment. I can tell, sorry, development or deployment, anything development I can tell. Okay, fine. So Spring Boot is an extension of Spring Framework that simplifies the development of Spring-based applications by reducing the configuration, comma, by providing the embedded servers and enabling the faster developments. If you think this definition is large, I can tell you a simple definition. Spring Boots make, I can tell you simple definition. In other words, in other words, I can tell you, in other words, Spring Boot makes Spring easy, fast, and developer friendly. And developer friendly. So with Spring Boot, we can directly, easily find, make our Spring applications easy, fast, and developer friendly. Fine. So what was why Spring Boot was introduced then? Why? Let me tell you why Spring Boot was introduced. Why Spring Boot was introduced. So let me tell you in a clear point. So why Spring Boot was introduced? The Spring Boot was introduced. Spring Boot was sorry. Spring Boot was introduced. Spring Boot was introduced to reduce the configuration. Reduce the configuration. Okay. Was Spring Boot was introduced to reduce the configuration, comma, to I can write as a point wise. Wait. Spring Boot was introduced to, let me write as a point wise here directly. Point wise. So it was introduced to reduce the configuration. So Spring Boot was introduced to reduce the configuration. And next point I can tell you, using Spring Boot, we can also eliminate the boilerplate code. Eliminate the boilerplate code. Boilerplate code in the sense writing the same line of code every. Boilerplate code in the sense writing the same lines of code again and again, again and again, again and again. But we don't need to write the same lines of code again and again. We can write one place, or we can write it one place. We can use that particular code every time. Okay. Eliminate the boilerplate code, and next it removes the server dependency. I can tell you the third point I can tell you is removes the server dependency. Okay, remove server dependency. And what next? We are going to have some speed up. Like we can speed up the development directly. We can speed up development. We can speed up the development. And next, I can tell you what next point. It can support the microservices also. Supports the I can tell you supports microservices. Okay, what is the microservices, monolithic, and everything with this? All the architectures are going to be discussed in a clear way, so don't get panic. So Spring Boot was introduced to reduce the configuration. It is going to eliminate the boilerplate code, and it is going to remove the server dependency, and it is going to speed up our development, and it is going to support our microservices. These are the disadvantages we have in Spring Framework, and those disadvantages are going to be covered as a advantage using Spring Boot. So these are explained in above very clearly. So let me explain you what are the key configurations or key features of the. Let me tell you what are the key features. Let me tell you what are the key features of Spring Boot directly. Key features of Spring Boot. Key features of Spring Boot. So key features of Spring Boot. Let me highlight this point. So what are the key features of Spring Boot in the sense auto configuration? Auto configuration. So in Spring, I have clearly explained you too much of configuration is the first disadvantage we have in Spring framework. But in Spring Boot, we are going to have auto configuration. Auto configuration is how auto configuration is nothing but automatically configures configures the bean definitions, or else I can tell you beans automatically configures beans. Beans are nothing but object. Beans are nothing but object, a reusable object. Okay. So automatically configures the beans based on the dependencies we have, based on the dependencies present in class path, based on the dependencies we have, or else dependencies present and based on the class path, based on the class path. So developers need not to, I can tell you, developers need not to, or else does not, I can tell you, developers does not need to write, developer does not need to write the configuration manually. Fine. So what are the concepts and points we have discussed in the disadvantages in Spring Boot? Those going to be discussed as automatic process. So whatever we have in Spring Framework, the too much configuration need to be done manually and don't need to be run by the developer only. But here in Spring Boot, we no need to write or we no need to do anything manually. Everything it is going to done automatically. So this is the first feature we have in Spring Boot, auto configuration. So let me say, for example, I will give you some examples also. So what if I will tell you how you are going to tell. See, here we have four disadvantages, right? A developer need to done four things. A developer need to done four things manually in Spring. How these are going to be covered? This four disadvantage. This how developer or how Spring Boot is going to do all these things automatically without using manual process. See these example. So let me tell you example. If we have one dependency in Spring, we have one dependency in Spring Boot start web. Spring Boot starter web, the spelling starter. Okay, starter only. I think starter. Okay. Spring Boot starter web. So if this dependency got added into your application, see, if this dependency got added into your Spring Boot application means if is added, well, in case ఈ డిపెండెన్సీ కనుక మన దాంట్లో యాడ్ అయితే, okay, if in case the Spring Boot starter web dependency got added, if this added means we are going to get we are going to get dispatcher servlet dispatcher servlet, and we are going to get Tomcat, and we are going to get Jackson or auto configured. Jackson or auto configured. So these are going to add by this dependency itself. So dispatcher servlet, everything, dispatcher servlet and Tomcat, everything got is going to added by the this single dependency. What is the single dependency we have? Spring Boot starter web. If this dependency got added, we are going to get all these three things got auto configured directly. Okay. So the next key feature of the Spring Boot is standard applications. Standard applications. What is meant by standard applications in the sense? So, oh, standalone applications. Sorry, not standard, standalone. So, what is meant by standalone applications? So, why I tell you? So, standalone application in the sense Spring Boot applications, Spring Boot applications can run as jar files called as can run. I can tell you can run as Java, can run as Java hyphen jar app.jar. So we can run our Spring Boot application as a jar file also. Not only as file, and also run our Spring Boot application as jar file. So Spring Boot application can run as Java uh, jar hyphen space app.jar. So this is going to be discussed. Don't worry. If you didn't understand this point, you are going to understand this point manually when we are implementing our applications. So fine. So next, what and no need to no need to install no need to install external dependency. I can tell you no need to install external dependency. I can also tell external Tomcat. If you are able unable to understand the point, I can write the definition what is meant by standalone applications and all. A standalone application, if any student they are unable to understand this particular point, I will write is meant by standalone. Then we'll get into the concept. A standalone application is an application. I can tell you standalone application is an application that runs independently, that runs independently without needing any external server, without needing and without needing an without needing an external server, without needing an external server. What we have external servers like Tomcat, or else JBoss, or else WebLogic, or else how many we have? Still Glassfish. So we etc. We may have so many things, but so leave. So standalone application is nothing but a standalone applications is an application that runs independently without needing any external servers. So we don't need any external server to run our application. So I told you clearly, Spring Boot can run our application as a command using called as Java hyphen jar or application name dot jar. We don't need any external application. Okay. So just like we can, I can tell you, just like okay. So we can run our I can tell you like we can run our Spring Boot application like a normal Java programs only. I can tell you we can run our Spring Boot application. We can now run our Spring Boot application like a manual or is like a normal Java programs, like a normal Java programs, and it works. How it is going to work in Spring Boot? So why Spring Boot a standalone application in the sense it is going to run without using any external server. We don't need any external server to run this. So we can run using a command called as Java space minus jar and our application dot jar file. Okay, we are going to discuss this thing in implementation part. So don't get panic about these things. Okay, so the key feature I'm going to discuss you is so let me write you here in a clear way. What are the embedded servers I'm going to use in we are having the embedded servers we are having is Tomcat, and we can by default use Tomcat, or else embedded server we are going to use by default is Spring Boot. By default embedded server is default by default is Tomcat server. So what if we don't have Tomcat? We are also having Jetty is as a embedded server, or else Undertow. Okay, Undertow. These are all the embedded servers by automatically we are having. But in Spring Boot by default we are going to have Tomcat by default. How we are going to get? I will show you. So next. So the next configuration is so Spring Boot status. Spring Boot status. Don't think starters are like a food item or any items. Spring starter. Starter is nothing but dependency. I can tell you. Spring Boot status. Spring Boot status. What is meant by Spring Boot status? Okay, don't think status as a food item. I can tell you what is meant by status. Status is equal to pre-configured dependencies, or I can say pre-configured dependency bundle, a set of bundles. Okay, In that, we are going to have so many dependencies. We can choose any dependencies from the page. I will tell you how we are going to get it. For example, let me tell you one dependency. Example. For example, I can give you one dependency as string. I have gave you above directly. Let me copy this directly. So Spring, it is a dependency. Spring hyphen boot hyphen starter hyphen web. So what this dependency is going to include? It includes it includes Spring MVC. It includes Tomcat. It includes Jackson. It includes validation. It includes logging. It including all these five in a single dependency. In the single dependency, we are going to get all these features added. Okay. So next, I can tell you simple point. No need to add each dependency separately. No need to add each dependency separately. So by adding this one dependency, we are going to get all these five dependencies automatically. We no need to add any separate dependency for logging. We no need to add separate dependency for validation. We no need to add Jackson dependency. We no need to add Tomcat dependency. All these five components or all these five dependencies are going to add it automatically by adding single dependency. The single dependency we are going to add is Spring Boot Starter Web. By adding this dependency, we are going to get all these five. Okay, so fine. So let me write as a point here. So fine. So the next point I'm going to discuss is production deployment, like production ready features. So what is a production ready features in the sense production ready features? Production ready features. What is the production ready features? I can tell you. We are going to have the actuator automatically. Actuator. Okay. So what is the production ready features? We are going to check our health checks are going to be done automatically. Health checks. How we are going to check health check? We are going to discuss in the upcoming sessions. Don't worry. So we are going to have the metrics we have, and we are going to have monitoring automatically, and we are going to have the application info. We are going to get the application info. How we are going to check, how we are going to get all these application info. We can write some API endpoints to get. I can tell you the example endpoints or example APIs we are going to create in upcoming classes. I can tell you as we are going to create some like APIs and all actuators. We are going to create some APIs, some actuators for checking our health and health of everything and all. If you want to check manual, if you want to see the health checks, we can write the APIs. If you don't want to see the health checks, we can automatically ignore this because by automatically these are going to be done by Spring Boot. Okay, Spring Boot only. So let me get into the next concept: microservices support. Microservices support. So microservices support. So what I can say, Spring Boot is Spring Boot is lightweight. Spring Boot is light, faster setup, or I can say faster startup. Okay, faster startup and easy to deploy, and cloud friendly also. Cloud friendly. Okay, so it is going to be ideal for. I can say it is ideal for. It is ideal for creating REST APIs, REST APIs and microservices, creating REST APIs and microservices, and we can also create a cloud native apps. It is ideal for the cloud native apps. Ideal for the cloud native apps, and we can say I can tell you the next as Spring Boot CLI. What is meant by CLI? Command line tool. Spring Boot CLI. What is meant by CLI in the sense command line tool? It is going to use it to run the Spring Boot apps using Groovy and most optional for the beginners. If you don't want to run your application under as Maven, we can also select Groovy, and we can also select our build tool as a Groovy, and we can run our applications using this Spring Boot client. So I can tell you CLI as a command line tool. Okay, it is going to be used. I can tell you it is going to be used. It is going to be used for running Spring. It is going to you will use it to run Spring apps, Spring apps using Groovy, and I think it is also optional. It's mostly optional for the beginners. Mostly optional for beginners. No need to learn this Spring Boot CLI. Okay. If you want to, if you have interest, you can learn. If you don't have interest, you no need to learn this thing. You can just I can just have one point as mostly optional for the beginners. So how Spring Boot I can tell you. So these are the disadvantages we have in Spring Boot, and these are the advantages we have in Spring. We discussed the disadvantages in Spring Framework, and we discussed the advantages of Spring Boot. So how the Spring Boot solves the Spring Framework problems. On the above, I discussed the disadvantages of Spring Framework, and now we successfully discussed advantages of Spring Boot. So the point now I'm just going to discuss is how Spring Boot, how Spring Boot solves, how Spring Boot solves Spring Framework problems. Spring Framework problems. So what are the problems we have in Spring Framework? Let me copy this directly without writing again and again. So let me copy this. So these are the problems we have in Spring Framework. Okay. So let me I'm going to remove the things. Okay. I'm mentioning the problems we have in Spring Framework, and in Spring Boot uh, how we just do it. I'll explain you like this. In Spring Boot, I will write like this to avoid confusion. Okay. In Spring Boot, we have auto configuration. Fine. Again, let me copy this. Again, paste it here. And in Spring Boot, we have embedded server. And for the next, in Spring Boot, we have starters. Spring Boot, we have configuration and time consuming slow setup. In Spring Boot, we have Spring initializer and less micro friendly. In Spring Boot, we have actuator. Okay, like I can tell you slower setup. Okay, in microservices in the sense in Spring Boot we have microservices ready. Microservices ready. Fine. And for monitoring, we have actuator. So in Spring, too much like I'm writing as simple points. Okay. In Spring, external server required. In Spring, dependency management has to be done. I'm not writing the point, meaningful point. Just I'm writing this. And in Spring, this is the disadvantage, and in Spring Boot, this is the advantage. I'm mentioning like this. Okay, for the quick understanding process, I don't need to write the full points. Right, for time saving purpose only, I'm writing like this. So understand for this for now. So in Spring, no built-in monitoring. So these are all the disadvantages. These are all the disadvantages. Okay. Just highlighting the points. These are all the disadvantages in Spring. And in the next phase, I have completely mentioned the advantages, how those covered in Spring Boot. Okay. So let me highlight the advantages also as well. In Spring Boot, we have everything. I have clearly discussed what is meant by everything. So microservices ready, actuator ready. So fine. These are the how it is going to solve. So in this way, Spring Boot is going to solve each and every problem we are facing in Spring frameworks. Okay. So next, I can tell you some important terminology. I can tell you what is meant by Spring initializer. I haven't discussed about Spring initializer. So everyone should know before learning or before getting into the concept of Spring Boot, everyone must know what is meant by Spring Initializer. So let me copy the Spring Initializer. What is meant by Spring Initializer? It is a tool. I can tell you, it is a tool. It is a tool. It is a tool to create. It is a tool to create Spring Boot projects quickly. Spring Boot projects quickly. So fine. In the using this Spring Initializer, we can create our projects quickly. So the next point we have, I can tell you, I can give you in the next point here itself. Okay. In using the Spring Initializer, we are going to build our, or can we are going to create our Spring Boot projects quickly. Fine. So what it is going to generate? Okay, it generates the project structure automatically. It generates the project structure automatically, and it adds the dependencies also automatically. How it is going to add the dependencies automatically, I will show you step by step process, so don't get panic. So the next, it is going to add the configuration automatically. How auto configuration, how everything I'm going to explain you, how I'm going to show you in picture. Okay, I'm going to show you in picture in a detailed manner. So don't get worried about it. Spring Initializer is nothing but it is a tool that we are going to create. Using this tool, we are going to create our Spring Boot projects quickly, and it generates the project structure and dependencies configuration automatically. So fine. So as of now, we have clearly discussed what are the disadvantages in Spring Framework and advantages of Spring Boot. What is Spring Boot? Everything clear, and how Spring Boot is going to solve the Spring Framework problems. Everything is explained very much detailed process in a theoretical way. So in the next upcoming classes, we are going to discuss some concepts, and I will get into the creation of a Spring Boot first bit, and how to create APIs in Spring Boot, and how to perform any operation, how to send an email using Spring Boot, and how to perform how to create or how to set up or how to complete an entire backend application and end-to-end backend application. Everything is going to be discussed clearly by end of this course. Okay.